Imagine a world where a woman's body was not her own, where her ability to give life was calculated, recorded, and exploited for profit. In the system of American slavery, pregnancy was not viewed as a moment of hope or family, it was treated as an economic strategy. Enslaved women were expected to bring new lives into the world not for love, not for choice, but to increase wealth and power for others. This reality shaped every aspect of their existence. From a young age, enslaved women lived with the knowledge that their futures, their bodies, and even their children could be claimed and controlled. Pregnancy did not offer safety or compassion. Instead, it often meant heavier expectations, deeper fear, and unimaginable pressure. Each child born represented financial gain for plantation owners, while for the mother, it carried uncertainty, exhaustion, and emotional pain. Yet this side of history is rarely discussed. We often learn about slavery through statistics, laws, and labor systems, but far less attention is given to how deeply it invaded the most personal parts of human life. The experiences of enslaved women, especially during pregnancy, were deliberately ignored, minimized, or erased. Their voices were silenced, their suffering normalized, and their resilience overlooked. This story seeks to bring those hidden realities into the light, not to shock, but to remember, not to dwell in despair, but to understand how systems of power operate when humanity is stripped away. By confronting these truths, we honor the strength of the women who endured them and recognize how their stories still echo in the present. If you believe history should be told fully and honestly, take a moment to support this channel. Like this video, subscribe, and stay with us as we uncover stories that were never meant to be forgotten. For the women whose bodies were already claimed as part of an economic system, pregnancy did not soften the demands placed upon them. It only deepened the burden. The same system that viewed their ability to give birth as profitable refused to recognize their need for rest, care, or dignity. From the moment a pregnancy became visible, expectations did not ease. They intensified, as if the growing life inside them was simply another task to be managed alongside endless hours of labor. In the fields, days began before sunrise and stretched until the light faded. Pregnant women bent over rows of cotton, sugar cane, or tobacco, their backs etching as their bodies struggled to carry both child and workload. There was no separate measure of effort, no acknowledgement that pregnancy placed unique strain on the body. Productivity was the only standard that mattered. Falling behind, even slightly, was interpreted not as physical limitation but as defiance or weakness. The result was discipline, not compassion. As months passed and bellies grew heavier, fear became a constant companion. Each step across uneven ground carried the risk of a fall. Each long day without enough food or water drained strength that should have been reserved for survival. Still, the work continued. Pregnancy did not excuse a woman from quotas or expectations. Instead, it became something she was expected to endure silently. To ask for rest was to risk consequences that could be far worse than exhaustion. What made this reality especially cruel was its contradiction. Enslavers depended on enslaved women to carry pregnancies to term, yet they placed them in conditions that threatened both mother and child. Miscarriages were common, and when they occurred, blame often fell on the woman herself. Loss was treated as failure rather than tragedy, reinforcing the idea that her worth lay not in her humanity, but in her output. As childbirth approached, anxiety intensified. There was no pause in the rhythm of labor, no transition into care or preparation. Women worked until their bodies could no longer continue, sometimes leaving the fields only when labor pains became impossible to ignore. Even then, the expectation was clear. Survival meant returning quickly, often within days, to the same demands that had nearly broken them. This relentless cycle revealed the true nature of the system. Pregnancy was acknowledged only when it produced profit, never when it required protection. The body of an enslaved woman was treated as endlessly capable, her pain invisible unless it disrupted production. In this way, forced labor during pregnancy was not an accident of cruelty, but a deliberate expression of control, reinforcing the idea that there was no moment in her life before birth, during pregnancy, or after motherhood when she was allowed to belong to herself. Within this reality, endurance became a form of resistance. Even when it went unrecognized, every step taken in the fields, every breath drawn under impossible strain, carried the quiet defiance of survival. These women were not protected by pregnancy, nor spared by impending motherhood. They were expected to give life while being denied care, and to carry the future of a system that refused to see them as fully human. After months of exhausting labor carried out under unrelenting pressure, childbirth arrived not as a moment of relief, but as the most uncertain threshold an enslaved woman would ever face. By the time her body was finally allowed to stop working, it was often already depleted, weakened by hunger, long hours, and constant strain. The system that demanded her productivity until the very last moment offered little preparation for what came next. There were no assurances of safety, no trained physicians waiting nearby, and no guarantee that she would be allowed the time or care needed to survive the ordeal. Birth usually took place in cramped cabins or makeshift spaces, far removed from comfort or cleanliness. The woman labored surrounded by other enslaved women who did what they could with inherited knowledge and shared experience. Relying on tradition rather than formal training, their presence was an act of solidarity, but it could not replace proper medical care. Complications that might have been manageable elsewhere became life-threatening here, and pain was endured without relief, accepted as something inevitable rather than something to be addressed. What made childbirth especially dangerous was not only the physical environment, but the absence of choice. Decisions about how and when a woman gave birth were rarely hers to make. Her body was treated as something to be managed by others, and her suffering was often ignored unless it disrupted routine. Even in moments of extreme distress, intervention was guided by control rather than care, with little understanding of the long-term consequences for the mother. Infections were common, bleeding was poorly treated, and recovery was uncertain. Some women survived only to carry lasting injuries that followed them for the rest of their lives, shaping how they moved, worked, and endured pain. Others did not survive at all. Death during or shortly after childbirth was a constant threat, quietly accepted as part of the system rather than questioned as a failure of it. Each loss was recorded, if it, as an economic inconvenience rather than a human tragedy. For those who lived, there was rarely time to heal. The expectation of returning to work loomed almost immediately, reinforcing the idea that survival alone was enough. Physical weakness was seen as temporary, and the demands of labor resumed long before the body had recovered. In this way, childbirth became another stage in a continuous cycle of endurance, offering no clear beginning or end to suffering. This danger was deeply connected to everything that came before it. The same disregard that forced pregnant women into the fields carried over into the moment of birth. The system's priorities did not change when a new life entered the world. It simply adapted, continuing to extract value wherever possible. Childbirth, instead of marking a moment of care, exposed the full extent of a structure that valued control over compassion. Within this reality, survival itself became uncertain, and motherhood was shaped by fear as much as hope. The absence of medical care, relief from pain, and personal consent turned childbirth into a test of endurance few could face without lasting consequences. It revealed, more clearly than any law or record, how completely enslaved women were denied ownership of their own bodies, even in the most vulnerable moments of their lives. As the dangers of childbirth became an accepted part of enslaved life, another layer of suffering quietly unfolded, one that revealed how deeply control extended into the most vulnerable moments of a woman's existence. The absence of proper care did not always mean the absence of intervention. In many cases, it meant something far worse. When enslaved women were assisted during childbirth or treated for related conditions, their bodies were often subjected to practices driven not by compassion or understanding, but by authority and experimentation. These moments were shaped by the same logic that governed plantation life. Enslaved women were not seen as patients with voices and choices, but as bodies to be managed. During labor, movement and instinct were frequently restricted, as if the natural process of birth itself needed to be controlled. Physical restraint was used to limit resistance or discomfort, reducing a deeply human experience into something mechanical and impersonal. The goal was efficiency and order, not safety or dignity. Invasive procedures, often carried out with little understanding of long-term consequences, reflected a broader disregard for bodily autonomy. Decisions were made without explanation, consent, or concern for pain. What mattered most was whether the outcome aligned with the needs of those in power. If a woman survived and could return to work, the method was considered acceptable, regardless of the harm inflicted along the way. These practices did not exist in isolation. They were connected to the belief that enslaved women were fundamentally different, less sensitive, and more physically capable of enduring suffering. This false narrative allowed harmful methods to be justified and repeated, turning childbirth and medical treatment into sites of control rather than care. The same mindset that denied rest during pregnancy carried forward into these moments, reinforcing the idea that endurance was expected, not acknowledged. The consequences were lasting. Many women carried physical injuries that never fully healed, shaping the rest of their lives in ways that went unrecorded. Pain became chronic, movement more difficult, and future pregnancies even more dangerous. Yet these outcomes were rarely recognized as failures of the system. Instead, they were absorbed into it, treated as inevitable rather than preventable. What makes this history especially difficult to confront is how quietly it unfolded. There were few written records from the women themselves, not because their experiences were insignificant, but because they were denied the means to document them. Their suffering survived through fragments, through memory, and through the patterns that repeated themselves across plantations and generations. Each story, though rarely preserved in detail, points to a system that normalized harm while presenting itself as orderly and justified. In these moments of restraint and intrusion, the reality of enslavement became unmistakable. Even in childbirth, one of the most personal human experiences, enslaved women were denied control over their own bodies. Their pain was not an unfortunate side effect. It was an accepted cost of a system built on domination. Understanding this reality brings clarity to everything that came before it, revealing how deeply exploitation shaped not only labor and law, but life itself. Through this lens, childbirth and medical treatment were not exceptions to cruelty, but expressions of it. They demonstrated how power functioned when unchecked, reaching into moments that should have been guided by care and turning them into tools of control. Remembering this part of the story restores meaning to the suffering that was long dismissed, and reminds us that the denial of consent is never limited to one moment, but echoes through every stage of life. Behind the forced labor, the dangerous childbirths, and the invasive medical practices lay another truth that shaped the lives of enslaved women just as deeply, even if it was spoken of less openly. Sexual violence was woven into the structure of slavery itself, not as an isolated crime, but as a routine exercise of power. For enslaved women, the absence of legal protection meant that their bodies were always vulnerable, subject to the will of those who claimed ownership over them. This reality followed them from adolescence into adulthood. Young girls learned early that there were boundaries they could not defend and refusals that carried consequences. Enslavers held total authority, and that authority extended into the most private aspects of life. Coercion did not require justification, and silence was often the only means of survival. What resulted were pregnancies shaped not by choice or partnership, but by force and imbalance, leaving women to bear the physical and emotional weight alone. These forced pregnancies connected directly to the economic logic that governed everything else. Children born from these encounters were not seen as evidence of wrongdoing, but as additions to an enslaver's wealth. The same system that denied women rest during pregnancy and safety during childbirth also benefited from the conditions that caused those pregnancies in the first place. Violence and profit reinforced one another, creating a cycle that left no space for consent or protection. The emotional toll of this reality was profound. Enslaved women were expected to endure not only the physical consequences, but also the psychological strain of carrying a child conceived through coercion. There was no acknowledgement of trauma, no space to grieve or process what had been taken from them. Instead, pregnancy was treated as confirmation of usefulness, further tying a woman's value to her ability to produce life under circumstances she did not control. This abuse was rarely recorded in official documents, not because it was rare, but because the legal system did not recognize enslaved women as victims. Their experiences existed outside the boundaries of justice, leaving their stories to survive through personal accounts, oral histories, and the patterns evident across generations. The absence of formal acknowledgement allowed these violations to continue largely unquestioned, protected by laws that favored ownership over humanity. The consequences followed women long after childbirth. Forced pregnancies increased physical risk, making labor more dangerous and recovery more uncertain. They also deepened emotional wounds, especially when children were later taken away and sold. In these moments, sexual violence, reproductive control, and family separation converged, revealing how completely the system dismantled any sense of personal autonomy. Understanding this aspect of slavery brings coherence to the suffering described in every other stage of an enslaved woman's life. The exhaustion of pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, and the harsh medical practices did not occur independently. They were all rooted in the same denial of agency that made sexual violence possible and invisible. The system functioned precisely because it normalized these violations, embedding them so deeply that they became part of everyday existence. By recognizing how widespread and systemic this violence was, the story of enslaved women becomes clearer and more complete. Their experiences were not defined by isolated acts of cruelty, but by a structure that allowed power to override consent at every level. Remembering this truth does not reduce these women to their suffering. Instead, it restores context to their endurance and reminds us that the injustices they faced were not accidents of history, but deliberate outcomes of a system built on control. From the moment a child was born to an enslaved woman, the bond between mother and infant existed under a shadow that had been cast long before the first cry was heard. The system that controlled pregnancy, labor, and childbirth also dictated the fate of the child, defining it not as a person with a future, but as property with a price. This legal reality shaped motherhood into an experience filled with uncertainty, where love was inseparable from fear and attachment carried the constant risk of loss. Laws established across the colonies and later the states ensured that a child inherited the status of the mother. If she was enslaved, her child was enslaved as well, regardless of circumstance. This principle transformed birth into a transaction, binding the next generation to the same system of control. For mothers, it meant knowing that no matter how fiercely they loved or protected their children, they held no authority over their lives. Decisions about their futures rested entirely in the hands of others. In the earliest days, mothers did what they could to nurture their newborns, often while already anticipating separation. Care was provided in brief moments carved out between work demands, with little time to recover from childbirth or to rest. Even these early bonds were fragile. Many children were taken away shortly after they were weaned, sometimes within weeks or months, and sent to distant plantations or markets. There were no explanations offered, no goodbyes guaranteed, only the sudden absence of a child who had been held just days before. This separation was not treated as an exception or a tragedy by those in power. It was a routine practice, embedded in the management of plantations and estates. Children were listed in records alongside tools and livestock, their value measured in future labor rather than human connection. Mothers were expected to return to work almost immediately, carrying the weight of loss in silence, knowing that grief itself could be seen as disruption. The emotional impact of these separations was profound and enduring. For enslaved women, motherhood was shaped by constant vigilance and restraint, loving deeply while preparing for the possibility of sudden removal. Every moment with a child carried both tenderness and dread. The absence left behind was not temporary. Many mothers never saw their children again, their lives unfolding separately with no knowledge of one another's fate. This practice reinforced the same logic that governed every other aspect of enslavement. Sexual violence, forced labor during pregnancy, dangerous childbirth, and harsh medical treatment all fed into a system that viewed reproduction as a means to an end. The child was not the continuation of a family, but the continuation of profit. Motherhood was acknowledged only insofar as it served that purpose. What makes this reality especially devastating is how deeply it disrupted the most basic human relationships. Family, memory, and identity were fractured across generations, leaving gaps that could never be fully repaired. Stories passed down through oral history reveal how these losses echoed long after emancipation, shaping how descendants understood belonging and connection. The removal and sale of children were not isolated acts of cruelty, but expressions of a broader structure that denied enslaved women authority over their own lives and the lives they brought into the world. By controlling both mother and child, the system ensured its own continuation, binding future generations to the same cycle of exploitation. Understanding this truth brings clarity to the experiences that came before it. The fear surrounding pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth, and the trauma of coercion all culminated in this ultimate loss. For enslaved women, the knowledge that their children could be taken at any moment transformed motherhood into an act of quiet endurance. Remembering this part of the story restores depth to their suffering and honors the resilience required to love in a world determined to take everything away. As the cycle of forced pregnancy, dangerous childbirth, and family separation continued, it also drew the attention of a growing medical establishment eager to advance knowledge without questioning the cost. Enslaved women, already denied control over their labor and reproduction, found their bodies drawn into another sphere of exploitation, one that presented itself as progress while relying on their suffering. Medicine, like slavery itself, operated within a hierarchy that placed their lives at the very bottom. In the 19th century, complications from childbirth were common, and physicians sought solutions that would secure their reputations and advance their careers. For enslaved women, these complications did not lead to care in the way they might have for others. Instead, they became opportunities, without legal rights or the ability to refuse. Enslaved women were subjected to repeated medical procedures carried out in the name of innovation. Their pain was rarely considered, and their consent was never sought. James Marion Sims stands at the center of this history, often celebrated for contributions to gynecology that are still referenced today. What is less comfortably acknowledged is how those advances were achieved. Sims conducted experimental surgeries on enslaved women who had suffered injuries related to childbirth, operating on them multiple times as he refined his techniques. These women were not treated as patients with voices or choices, but as means to an end, their bodies serving as sites of trial and error. The beliefs that justified this treatment were deeply rooted in the same false ideas that sustained slavery itself. Enslaved women were portrayed as more physically resilient, less sensitive to pain, and therefore suitable subjects for experimentation. These assumptions allowed medical practitioners to proceed without addressing the ethical implications of their actions. Pain was normalized, endurance expected, and suffering reframed as necessity. For the women involved, the experience extended the trauma already embedded in their lives. Many had endured forced labor through pregnancy and dangerous births, only to find themselves subjected to repeated procedures with uncertain outcomes. Recovery was secondary to results. The focus remained on refining methods, not on the long-term well-being of those whose bodies made that refinement possible. What makes this history particularly unsettling is how seamlessly it fit into the broader system of control. Medical experimentation did not stand apart from slavery. It depended on it. The same lack of autonomy that allowed women to be coerced into pregnancy also made it possible for doctors to operate without accountability. Their bodies were accessible because they were owned, and their suffering was overlooked because it was socially sanctioned. The benefits of these experiments did not flow back to the women who endured them. Once techniques were deemed successful, they were often applied to white patients under far different conditions. With greater care and consideration, progress was achieved, but it was unevenly distributed, reinforcing the racial and social hierarchies that defined the era. The stories of these women were rarely recorded in their own words. Their names, experiences, and outcomes were often reduced to brief mentions or omitted entirely. Yet their presence is unmistakable in the foundations of modern medicine. Every advancement built on their pain carries with it a history that cannot be separated from the context in which it occurred. Understanding this chapter brings coherence to everything that preceded it. The exhaustion of forced labor, the danger of childbirth, the loss of children, and the absence of consent all converge here. Medical experimentation was not an aberration, but a continuation of the same logic that governed enslaved women's lives from beginning to end. By acknowledging this truth, the narrative shifts. These women are no longer invisible figures in the margins of medical history. They become central to it, reminding us that progress without ethics leaves deep scars. Remembering their experiences challenges us to consider whose bodies have been sacrificed in the name of advancement, and to recognize that true progress cannot exist without humanity. For generations, the suffering of enslaved pregnant women remained buried beneath silence. Omission and carefully shaped narratives, history-recorded laws, prophets, and political debates, but rarely the lived experiences of the women whose bodies sustained the system. Their pain was not denied because it was unknown, but because it was inconvenient. Enslaved women were discouraged from learning to read or write, their testimonies dismissed, and their humanity reduced to numbers on ledgers. As a result, entire chapters of their lives faded from public memory, leaving behind a version of history that felt incomplete and distant. Yet the absence of records does not mean the absence of consequences. The legacy of that erasure continues to shape the present. Patterns established during slavery, medical neglect, dismissal of pain, and unequal access to care did not disappear with emancipation. They evolved. Today, Black women continue to face higher risks during pregnancy and childbirth, as well as disparities in healthcare, income, and social support. These realities are not accidents of modern life. They are echoes of a past that was never fully confronted. Understanding this connection changes how we view both history and the present. The experiences of enslaved pregnant women reveal how deeply inequality can become embedded in institutions, traditions, and assumptions. When suffering is ignored long enough, it becomes normalized. When voices are silenced for generations, their absence shapes policies and perceptions in ways that are difficult to undo. Remembering these women is not about assigning blame to the past, but about recognizing responsibility in the present. Their stories also reveal extraordinary resilience. Despite the violence, loss, and control imposed upon them, enslaved women found ways to endure. to care for one another, and to protect fragments of family and identity whenever possible. Their strength did not come from the system that oppressed them, but from their refusal to be completely erased by it. By acknowledging their experiences, we restore dignity to lives that were systematically denied it. This history matters because it challenges us to look beyond surface-level narratives and ask deeper questions about whose stories are told and whose are ignored. It reminds us that progress is not only measured by laws passed or institutions built, but by whether humanity is recognized and protected for everyone. When we listen to the stories that were left out, we gain a clearer understanding of the inequalities that persist and the work still required to address them. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story and to engage with a part of history that is often overlooked. If you found this video meaningful, please support the channel by liking and subscribing. Your support helps ensure that these stories continue to be told, remembered, and shared, so that the voices once silenced are never forgotten again.